Life in Pine Creek County had always moved at its own steady pace, but everything changed when local girl Diane Cooper became the youngest female sheriff in Texas history. At just 32, she commanded respect not just because of her badge, but because of her razor-sharp instincts and genuine care for the community. People still remembered how she'd worked her way up from being a rookie deputy, solving cases that had stumped even the most seasoned officers. Her husband, Richard Parker, was cut from a different cloth entirely. While Diane was busy keeping the streets safe, he was climbing the corporate ladder at his tech company, Tech Vision Solutions. They'd met at a charity gala 5 years ago. She was handling security, and he was there representing his then-growing company. Their whirlwind romance had been the talk of the town, with many wondering how a small-town sheriff and a rising tech executive would make it work. But they did make it work, beautifully even. Richard admired Diane's dedication to justice, and she appreciated his drive for innovation. Their dinner conversations were a fascinating mix of criminal cases and corporate strategies. They'd balanced each other perfectly. When Richard got too caught up in his business world, Diane would bring him back to earth with her practical wisdom. And when Diane faced tough days at work, Richard's optimism would lift her spirits. Their modest ranch-style home became the perfect blend of their worlds. One room was filled with Diane's law enforcement awards and commendations, while Richard's office showcased his business achievements. They hosted barbecues where deputies mingled with tech executives, creating an unusual but harmonious mix of guests. Diane's days were filled with the kind of work that made her proud. She transformed the sheriff's department, introducing community policing programs that actually worked. Crime rates had dropped, and more importantly, people trusted their local law enforcement. Her deputies looked up to her, not just as a boss, but as a mentor who'd teach them everything from proper procedure to the importance of showing compassion. Richard's company was doing well too, but nothing prepared them for what happened that spring. Tech Vision developed a groundbreaking security software that caught the attention of major players in Silicon Valley. Suddenly, Richard wasn't just another tech CEO, he was the talk of the industry. Investors started circling, and the company's value skyrocketed overnight. The changes were subtle at first. Richard started working longer hours, attending more high-profile meetings. Their cozy dinner conversations became shorter, interrupted by important phone calls. Designer suits replaced his casual business wear, and he started talking about moving to a bigger house in a more prestigious neighborhood. Diane noticed the shift in their dynamic but tried to be supportive. She understood that Richard was dealing with immense pressure. The local paper ran a feature about them, titled Pine Creek's Power Couple, but behind the scenes, things were getting complicated. Richard's new business associates raised eyebrows at the fact that his wife was in law enforcement. They made subtle comments about image and social standing. One evening, as Diane was reviewing case files at their kitchen table, a routine she'd maintained for years, she caught Richard watching her with an odd expression. He'd just returned from a week-long business trip to New York, and something felt different. The way he loosened his tie, the way he poured himself a drink, it all seemed rehearsed, like he was preparing for something. Little did Diane know that their perfect balance was about to be tested in ways she never imagined. The next few weeks would challenge everything they'd built together, forcing them both to question what they really valued in life. The story that would unfold would become legendary in Pine Creek County, but not for the reasons anyone might have expected. As the sun set over their backyard, casting long shadows through the kitchen window, neither of them realized that this ordinary evening would be the last of its kind. The next day would bring a conversation that would change not just their lives, but the entire dynamic of their relationship forever. The evening started like any other. Diane had just finished a long shift, still wearing her sheriff's uniform as she stirred the pot of her grandmother's famous chili recipe. Richard had texted earlier saying he had big news to share. She assumed it was about the company's recent success, maybe another big contract or a new office opening. When Richard walked through the door, something was different. His usual warm smile was replaced with a determined look she'd only seen during his toughest business negotiations. He'd brought home an expensive bottle of wine, not their usual Tuesday night drink. The air felt heavy with unspoken words as they sat down at their kitchen table. "I got the investment deal," Richard announced, pouring the wine. "$5 billion. It's the biggest tech investment in Texas history." His voice carried an odd mix of triumph and tension. Diane started to congratulate him, but he raised his hand, indicating there was more. "There's something we need to discuss." The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Steam rose from their untouched bowls of chili as Richard cleared his throat. "The investors, they have certain expectations about the company's image." "About my image?" "About our image as a couple." Diane felt her stomach tighten. After 15 years in law enforcement, she'd developed a sixth sense for when something was about to go wrong. "What kind of expectations?" she asked, already dreading the answer. "They think." Richard paused, swirling the wine in his glass. "They think having a wife in law enforcement sends the wrong message. These are conservative investors, old money families. They expect a certain lifestyle from their business partners." The words hung in the air like smoke. Diane pushed her bowl away, her appetite gone. "What exactly are you saying, Richard?" "I need you to resign as sheriff," he said finally, the words tumbling out. "We're moving into a different social circle now. These people expect their wives to be, well, more traditional, managing the home, organizing charity events, supporting their husbands' careers." Diane laughed, thinking it was a joke. But Richard's face remained serious. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My career, my department, my people, you want me to just walk away from all of that?" "Think about it logically," Richard pressed on, his business voice taking over. "With this investment, we'll never have to worry about money again. You won't need to work. We can have the life we've always dreamed of. Vacation homes, private jets, the best of everything." "The life you've dreamed of," Diane corrected him, standing up from the table. Her chair scraped against the floor, making them both wince. "My dream was serving this community, making a difference. Remember when you used to admire that about me?" The conversation spiraled into their first real fight in years. Richard talked about social obligations, image consultants, and the importance of fitting into their new world. Diane countered with community responsibility, personal integrity, and the oath she'd taken to serve and protect. "You have 2 weeks to decide," Richard finally said, his voice cold in a way she'd never heard before. "The investors want everything finalized by the end of the month." That night, Diane lay awake in their bed, listening to Richard's steady breathing beside her. Her mind raced through memories. Her graduation from the police academy, her first day as deputy, winning the sheriff's election. She thought about her team, the ongoing cases, the community programs she'd built from scratch. The next morning at the sheriff's office, everything looked different. Her deputies noticed something was wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to tell them. How could she explain that her husband, who'd once been her biggest supporter, now saw her badge as an embarrassment? As she sat in her office, staring at the photos on her wall, pictures of successful drug busts, community outreach events, award ceremonies, her phone buzzed with messages from Richard. Links to luxury homes in gated communities, pictures of charity galas, a reminder about meeting with his image consultant. The weight of the decision pressed down on her like a physical thing. She had 2 weeks to choose between the life she'd built and the life Richard wanted her to live. 2 weeks to decide if their marriage was worth sacrificing everything she'd worked for. Little did she know, this ultimatum was just the beginning. The choice she would make would set in motion a chain of events that nobody, not even Richard with all his careful planning, could have predicted. The 2 weeks passed like a blur. Diane spent her days going through the motions at work, her nights tossing and turning as she wrestled with her decision. Her deputy chief, Tom, noticed something was wrong. He'd worked with her for 10 years and could read her better than most. "Everything okay, boss?" he asked one morning, bringing her the usual coffee from the diner across the street. "You seem distracted lately." The concern in his voice made everything harder. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup, buying time before answering. The morning sun streamed through her office window, highlighting the dust particles in the air. How many mornings had she spent in this office, planning operations, helping people, making a real difference? "I'm thinking about stepping down," she finally said, the words feeling like betrayal in her mouth. Tom's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. The silence that followed was deafening. "This is about Richard's new deal, isn't it?" Tom asked quietly. News traveled fast in their small town, and Richard's billion-dollar investment had made headlines. Diane just nodded, unable to meet his eyes. That afternoon, she called a department meeting. Looking at the faces of her team, people she'd trained, mentored, worked alongside through good times and bad, made her heart ache. Officer Jenny, who she'd helped through the academy. Detective Wilson, who'd finally solved that cold case last month. Even grumpy old Pete from Dispatch, who pretended to be tough, but always brought homemade cookies to staff meetings. "I've made a decision," she announced, her voice steady despite the storm inside. "I'll be stepping down as sheriff at the end of the month." The room erupted in shocked whispers and protests. She raised her hand for silence, just like she'd done countless times before, but this time it felt different. "Is this what you really want?" Jenny asked after the meeting, catching her in the hallway. The young officer's eyes were filled with confusion and hurt. "You're the reason I became a cop, you know that?" Each conversation felt like a small goodbye. Every familiar face in the department reminded her of shared experiences, late-night stakeouts, Christmas parties, tough cases solved together. The weight of her decision grew heavier with each passing hour. At home, Richard was already making plans. He'd hired an interior decorator for their new house, scheduled meetings with social clubs, and talked endlessly about their new life. He seemed oblivious to her pain, or perhaps he chose to ignore it. The day she typed up her resignation letter, her hands shook so badly she had to start over 3 times. The formal language felt cold and impersonal. "I hereby tender my resignation as Sheriff of Pine Creek County, effective immediately." How could 13 words sum up 15 years of service? The local newspaper got wind of the story before she could even submit the letter. Their phone started ringing nonstop. Reporters wanted to know why the youngest female sheriff in Texas history was stepping down at the height of her career. Richard hired a PR firm to handle the press, crafting a story about family priorities and new chapters. The hardest part was clearing out her office. Each item she packed held a memory. The commendation for solving the Henderson kidnapping case, the photo of her first swearing-in ceremony, the coffee mug her team had given her with "World's Best Boss" written in faded letters. Tom helped her pack, neither of them saying much. When they got to the wall of photos, years of community events, successful operations, award ceremonies, he finally spoke up. "You know, I always thought I'd be retiring before you. Never imagined it would end like this." On her last day, the entire department lined up outside to give her a final salute. It was a tradition usually reserved for retiring officers who'd served their full term. As she walked past each familiar face, memories flooded back, the good times, the hard times, the lives they'd touched together. Richard wasn't there for her last walk out of the building. He was in New York, finalizing details with the investors. Instead, she drove home alone, her badge and gun belt sitting in a box on the passenger seat. The setting sun painted the sky orange over Pine Creek, the town she'd sworn to protect and serve. That night, as she hung up her uniform for the last time, something shifted inside her. This wasn't just about giving up a job, it was about losing a part of herself. As she stared at her reflection in the bedroom mirror, she wondered if Richard really understood what he'd asked her to sacrifice. Little did she know, this ending would soon prove to be just another beginning. Sometimes the biggest changes in life come disguised as losses, and the hardest goodbyes lead to unexpected hellos. The transition from sheriff to housewife hit Diane harder than she'd expected. Their new mansion in the exclusive Oakwood Heights neighborhood felt more like a museum than a home. Everything was perfectly arranged, expensive artwork on the walls, crystal chandeliers overhead, furniture that looked too delicate to actually use. Her mornings, once filled with briefings and patrol schedules, now revolved around meeting interior decorators and planning dinner parties. Richard had hired a social coordinator named Beverly, a perfectly coiffed woman who spoke in hushed tones about proper society and maintaining appearances. "Darling, you simply must learn to walk in heels," Beverly instructed during one of their sessions. "And that handshake of yours, too firm. Remember, we're going for elegant, not authoritative." Each criticism chipped away at another piece of who Diane used to be. The other wives in their social circle were different from anyone Diane had known before. They spent their days at exclusive spa treatments and charity committee meetings, discussing their husbands' latest business deals in whispered tones. Their problems seemed so distant from the real-world issues she used to handle daily. "You'll get used to it," said Patricia, one of the wives, during a tennis lesson Diane hadn't wanted to take. "I used to be a corporate lawyer before I married Charles. Now I can't imagine going back to that stressful life." But Patricia's perfectly practiced smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Richard was hardly ever home anymore. When he was, he spent most of his time on video calls or typing away on his laptop. Their once warm conversations had been replaced by quick instructions about upcoming social events or criticisms about her adaptation to their new lifestyle. "The Hendersons mentioned you used police jargon at the dinner party last night," he said one evening, not looking up from his phone. "Try to watch that. It makes people uncomfortable." The fact that he now found her law enforcement background embarrassing stung more than she wanted to admit. Diane started taking long drives around town in her new luxury car, sometimes passing by the sheriff's department. She'd slow down, watching her old colleagues going about their day. Once she spotted Tom and Jenny heading out on patrol, probably responding to a call. Her hand instinctively reached for a radio that wasn't there anymore. The isolation grew worse as weeks passed. Richard monitored her spending through their shared accounts, questioning every purchase that didn't fit their new image. Her old friends from the force stopped calling, whether out of respect for her new life or discomfort with her changed status, she wasn't sure. One afternoon, while organizing Richard's home office as he requested, she found a document he'd left open on his desk. It was a detailed plan for rebranding their public image, complete with scheduled appearances, wardrobe requirements, and even scripted responses for common questions. Her entire existence had been reduced to a PR strategy. That evening, she tried to talk to him about it. "I feel like I'm losing myself," she admitted as he rushed through dinner. "Maybe I could do some consulting work? Or volunteer at the—" "We've discussed this," he cut her off, his tone eerily similar to the one he used in business negotiations. "You agreed to this arrangement. The investors are finally happy with our image. Don't rock the boat now." The breaking point came during a charity gala at their house. Diane overheard two guests discussing a recent break-in at their neighbor's house. Her investigator's mind immediately kicked in, asking relevant questions about timing and evidence. The room went awkwardly quiet. "Dinner in, sweetie," Richard called from across the room, his smile tight. "Why don't you check on the catering?" The dismissal was clear. She was embarrassing him again. Later that night, as she stood in their massive walk-in closet, surrounded by designer clothes she never would have chosen for herself, Diane caught her reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman staring back at her was wearing a $1,000 dress and perfect makeup, but her eyes looked hollow. She pulled out her old uniform from the back of the closet, hidden behind rows of cocktail dresses. The familiar weight of the fabric in her hands brought tears to her eyes. This wasn't just about missing her job. It was about missing who she used to be. What she didn't know then was that fate was about to hand her an opportunity to reclaim herself, but in a way she never could have anticipated. Sometimes the universe has a way of turning gilded cages into launching pads for something much bigger. Everything changed on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Diane was in Richard's home office, organizing his files as he requested. She'd been doing this more often lately. He claimed his assistant was overwhelmed with the company's rapid growth. The task felt beneath her abilities, but it gave her something to do besides attending endless charity luncheons. While sorting through a stack of documents, a folder labeled Project Phoenix caught her eye. She remembered overhearing Richard mention it during a late-night phone call, speaking in hushed tones. Her old investigator's instincts, dormant but never truly gone, sparked to life. The folder contained financial reports that didn't match the public records she'd seen in the newspaper. Numbers that didn't add up, transactions that seemed to lead nowhere. Her law enforcement training kicked in as she noticed patterns, the same kind she'd seen in money laundering cases. "What are you doing?" Richard's voice from the doorway made her jump. She hadn't heard him come home. His face darkened when he saw the folder in her hands. "Those are confidential company documents." "I was just organizing, like you asked," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. But 15 years of interrogating suspects had taught her to recognize guilt, and Richard's face showed it clearly. "Want to tell me about Project Phoenix?" The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's usual smooth confidence cracked for just a moment. It's complicated business matters, nothing for you to worry about. He held out his hand for the folder, but Diane didn't move. Complicated like the offshore accounts, or complicated like the mismatched inventory numbers? Her mind was racing, connecting dots she'd subconsciously noticed over the past months. The late-night calls, the nervous investors, the sudden urgency to change their public image. Richard's expression hardened. "You're not a cop anymore, remember? You gave that up. This is my business, and you need to stay out of it." He snatched the folder from her hands, his fingers gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. That night, Diane lay awake, her mind spinning. The woman Richard had turned her into, the quiet, obedient housewife, would have ignored what she'd seen. But the sheriff in her, the part of her soul he couldn't erase, knew this wasn't something she could walk away from. The next morning, after Richard left for work, she started digging. Years of investigative experience guided her as she carefully searched his office. She photographed documents with her phone, noted down names and dates, and started building a timeline of suspicious activities. Her big break came when she overheard Richard's phone conversation through his study door. He'd forgotten to close it properly during a heated late-night call. "The auditors are getting too close," he was saying. "We need to move those assets now, before they trace them back to the original accounts." Everything clicked into place. The rushed investment deal, the sudden pressure for her to quit her job, the careful crafting of their public image, it was all a smokescreen. Richard needed a respectable family image to distract from what was happening behind the scenes. Using her old law enforcement contacts, she quietly verified her suspicions. The evidence pointed to a massive fraud scheme, inflated company valuations, hidden accounts, and manipulated records. Richard wasn't just bending the rules, he was breaking federal laws. One afternoon, while pretending to plan another charity event, Diane drove to a coffee shop across town. There, she met with Tom, her former deputy chief, now acting sheriff. She'd chosen the location carefully, somewhere Richard's business associates would never go. "I need your help," she said, sliding a USB drive across the table. "But this has to be handled carefully. Lives and careers are at stake." Tom looked at the drive, then back at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. As she drove home that day, past the manicured lawns and massive houses of their exclusive neighborhood, Diane felt something she hadn't experienced in months: purpose. The hollow feeling in her chest was replaced by a familiar determination, the same one she'd felt before major operations in her sheriff days. Richard had made a crucial mistake. In trying to turn her into a trophy wife, he'd given her a front-row seat to his illegal activities. He'd forgotten that you can take the badge away from a sheriff, but you can't take away the instincts, the training, or the dedication to justice. That evening, as she watched Richard work in his study, completely unaware of what she'd discovered, Diane realized that sometimes the biggest cases of your career come when you least expect them. And sometimes the perfect position to uncover the truth is right when nobody expects you to be looking. Getting evidence was one thing, knowing what to do with it was another. Diane spent sleepless nights planning her next moves. She knew from experience that timing was everything in cases like this. Move too fast and evidence could disappear. Move too slow and more people could get hurt. She started by reaching out to her old contacts at the FBI. Agent Wilson, who'd worked with her on several cross-jurisdiction cases, agreed to meet her at a small diner 2 towns over. The place was perfect, busy enough to blend in, but not somewhere Richard's business circles would ever visit. "This is bigger than we thought," Agent Wilson said, reviewing the evidence she'd gathered. "These transactions, they're just the tip of the iceberg. We've had suspicions about similar patterns in other tech companies, but could never get solid proof." Diane sipped her coffee, watching customers come and go. "The investors," she said quietly. "They're not just victims, are they? Some of them are in on it." The agent's slight nod confirmed her suspicions. Back at home, maintaining a normal routine became increasingly difficult. Every dinner party, every social event felt like an undercover operation. She'd sit there, smiling and nodding as Richard's business partners discussed their successful ventures, knowing she was gathering intel on each of them. One evening, during a dinner party at their house, she overheard 2 board members discussing an upcoming board meeting. "The auditors are coming next week," one whispered. "Richard says everything's handled, but..." Diane knew this was the moment. The next morning, after Richard left for work, she contacted Tom. It needs to happen before that board meeting, she explained. Once they realize they're being investigated, documents will start disappearing. The FBI moved quickly but quietly. They needed to coordinate with multiple agencies, gathering teams and resources without tipping off any of the suspects. Diane provided crucial information about Richard's schedule, security systems, and file storage. The hardest part was acting normal around Richard. He'd become increasingly agitated, spending long hours in his home office, having heated phone conversations in whispered tones. One night, he snapped at her for entering his study without knocking. The man she'd married seemed to be disappearing before her eyes. "The charity gala is this weekend," he reminded her over breakfast. "The governor will be there. Everything needs to be perfect." Little did he know, the guest list would include several undercover agents. The day before the planned raid, Diane went through her normal routine. She attended her tennis lesson, met with the party planner, and smiled through lunch with the other executives' wives. Inside, her heart was racing. Years of law enforcement experience helped her keep her composure, but this was different. This was personal. That evening, Richard was unusually attentive. "You've really adapted well to this life," he said, pouring her a glass of wine. "I know the transition wasn't easy, but look at us now." The irony of his words made her stomach turn. She lay awake that night, listening to Richard's steady breathing beside her. She thought about their early days together, when he'd supported her career, celebrated her achievements. Where had that man gone? Or had he always been hiding behind a mask, waiting for the right moment to show his true face? The next morning dawned bright and clear. Diane watched Richard get ready for work, straightening his expensive tie in the mirror. "Big day today," he said, kissing her cheek. "Board meeting this afternoon, then dinner with the investors." "Be careful driving," she said, the words catching in her throat. It would be the last normal morning they'd ever share. At exactly 2:45 p.m., as the board meeting was getting underway, the FBI stormed Tech Vision's offices. Simultaneously, teams moved on the homes and offices of key conspirators. The operation was a masterpiece of timing and coordination, something Diane would have appreciated more if her heart wasn't breaking. She watched the news coverage from her living room, surrounded by the luxury that fraud had bought. The reporters were having a field day. Tech CEO arrested in massive fraud scheme. The footage showed Richard being led out of his office in handcuffs, his perfect image crumbling before the cameras. Her phone started ringing nonstop. Friends, acquaintances, reporters. But the only call she took was from Tom. "You did the right thing," he said simply. "You're still protecting and serving, just on a bigger scale this time." As the sun set on that momentous day, Diane stood in her kitchen, the same spot where Richard had demanded she give up her badge months ago. She realized that sometimes justice takes unexpected paths, and that true strength isn't in maintaining appearances, but in standing up for what's right, no matter the personal cost. The aftermath of Richard's arrest sent shockwaves through their community. Reporters camped outside their mansion, hoping to catch a glimpse of the former sheriff who brought down her CEO husband. The story was everywhere. Wife turns tables on corrupt CEO, from sheriff to whistleblower. A story of justice. The other wives from their social circle vanished overnight. Their calls went unanswered, lunch dates were cancelled, and Diane's name was quietly removed from all charity committee lists. Only Patricia, the former corporate lawyer, reached out with a simple text: "You did what many of us wished we had the courage to do." The first time Diane visited Richard in detention, the contrast between them couldn't have been starker. His designer suit had been replaced by standard-issue clothing, his confident smile now uncertain and strained. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We had everything." "No, Richard," she replied, her voice steady. "We had things. We lost everything that really mattered long before this." As she stood to leave, he called after her, "I did it for us." But they both knew that wasn't true. The federal investigation revealed a web of corruption larger than anyone had imagined. Several board members were implicated, along with investors from 3 different countries. The conservative investors who'd been so concerned about having a sheriff for a wife turned out to be front companies for money laundering operations. Tom visited her one evening, bringing a box of her old things from the sheriff's office. "The department's proud of you," he said, setting it down on her kitchen counter. You're still teaching us lessons about integrity, even from the outside." As the legal proceedings moved forward, Diane received an unexpected call from a women's advocacy group. They wanted her to speak at their conference about standing up against corporate corruption. At first, she hesitated. Public speaking had never been her favorite part of the job. But standing at that podium, looking out at a sea of faces, she found her voice. "Sometimes life strips away everything you thought you needed," she told them, "only to show you everything you really are." The speech went viral. Soon, other organizations started calling. Women who'd been pressured to give up their careers, whistleblowers afraid to come forward, people struggling to choose between comfort and conscience, they all wanted to hear her story. One rainy afternoon, while sorting through the remains of their shared life, Diane found her old badge in Richard's study. He'd kept it in his desk drawer, perhaps as a trophy of his victory over her career. Now holding it, she realized it had never been about the badge itself, but what it represented: integrity, service, justice. That discovery led to an idea. Using her combined experience in law enforcement and her newfound understanding of corporate crime, she started a consulting firm. Her mission was simple: helping companies build ethical business practices and supporting whistleblowers who needed guidance. Her first client was a tech startup whose female CEO wanted to ensure they grew the right way. "I followed your story," the CEO said during their first meeting. "It made me realize we need more people who understand both sides, law enforcement and business." The firm grew quickly, attracting clients who genuinely wanted to do things right. Diane hired other former law enforcement officers, creating a team that bridged the gap between corporate compliance and practical security. She even brought in Patricia, who was eager to use her legal skills for something meaningful again. 1 year after Richard's arrest, Diane stood in front of the sheriff's department, this time as a guest speaker for their training program. The topic: corporate crime and ethics. Looking at the fresh faces of new deputies, she felt a familiar warmth in her heart. "Life doesn't always take you where you expect," she told them. "Sometimes you have to lose your way to find your true path. The badge isn't just a piece of metal, it's a commitment to doing what's right, even when it costs you everything." The old station looked exactly the same, but she was different. Stronger, wiser, more certain of who she was and what she stood for. She'd lost a husband but found herself, lost a position but gained a purpose. That evening, driving home in her now modest car to her now modest house, Diane felt truly peaceful for the first time in years. Her phone buzzed with messages from clients, speaking requests, and a reminder about tomorrow's workshop for corporate ethics officers. She smiled, thinking about how life comes full circle. She was still protecting and serving, just in a different way. And somewhere out there, other women were finding the courage to stand up, speak out, and reclaim their own power, one story at a time.